Hello, everybody, and welcome to English with Ameya, sir. And today we are going to study the poem Night of the Scorpion by Nissim Ezekiel. It's a unit 3.1 by the SSC board. By the way, this is really one of my favorite poems, and it really brings out the true selfless love of a mother, especially the climax. You would love the climax. Anyway, let's get started. So basically, before we start with the poem, let's learn something about the poet. Nissim Ezekiel was an Indian Jewish poet. The name Nissim Ezekiel could probably tell you that he was someone outside of India, but he was an Indian Jewish poet. In fact, he was from Mumbai, and if I'm not wrong, he passed away also when he was in Mumbai. He was conferred with the Sahitya Akademi Cultural Award in 1983, and he was honored with the Padma Shri Award in 1988. It's one of the highest civilian awards. He used satire to ridicule the human follies due to lack of education or scientific approach. So clearly you would find that even in this poem he has used satire as a medium to bring out the shortcomings in human behavior due to lack of education, due to lack of understanding. So you would find out that very soon. Now about the poem. So this poem is an example of a free verse. In fact, in our earlier study of Unit 1.1, also you saw this, which means that because this is an example of a free verse, this poem has neither any rhyme nor rhythm. The tone of the poem is satirical. That's the style and the feature of Nissim Ezekiel's writing. This poem is based on rural surroundings where the poet's mother gets stung by a scorpion. And well, I hope not, but if unfortunately, if any one of you has ever undergone that kind of pain and agony, will know and probably understand the emotions of the mother in the poem. The poem has been bejeweled with interesting figures of speech, in particular, the pun. The climax of the poem, as I've already mentioned it once, shows the true selfless love of a mother. Simply amazing. I have no doubt that you would love the climax. Let's get started now with the poem. The lines. I remember the night my mother was stung by a scorpion. 10 hours of steady rain had driven him to crawl beneath a sack of rice. Well, the picture of the scorpion does show how deadly it can be. Before I move to the explanation, it is perfectly okay for you to have your textbook by your side, just for reference, or just in case you want to do any markings. And wherever you feel the need, you can pause the video and continue. So, what are these lines? The poet recalls the incident where there was steady rain and the scorpion had taken shelter beneath a sack of rice. So, this is typical village setup. There's not much modernization there, so it's quite possible for a scorpion to have crawled into the house. And it is interesting to note, all students should make a note of this, that the poet has used the pronoun him for the scorpion. Now, scorpion is a creature, you can use it, but because it's an important part of the poem, I think the poet has used the pronoun him when he says it had driven him to crawl beneath a sack of rice. So it had taken shelter beneath a sack of rice. Let's study the figures of speech for this part. So my mother, now that's alliteration. The sound M has been repeated for a better poetic effect. Not the letter M, the sound M. Okay. Let's move on. The part from the poem now. Parting with his poison, flash of a diabolic tale in the dark room, he risked the rain again. Poet's mother was the unfortunate victim of the scorpion's sting. Really unfortunate, and I've already, I've asked your experience if God forbid, if you have ever undergone this, it's just massive. It's very painful. So you can imagine what the mother felt. Note here that there is a difference between poison and venom, and I would have rather liked if the poet had used the word venom. Venom is something that is natural, while poison is something that is created by reaction or something. So venom is natural, poison is a created toxic substance. So you might have heard of people suffering from food poisoning, not from food venoming, from food poisoning. Students should know this difference. It's a very important difference between the two. Venom is something, so cobra is venomous, it's natural. Poison is created toxic substance. Now let's study the figures of speech for this part. Parting with this poison, and that is one of the reasons why Nissim Ezekiel is used poison, because parting with his poison makes for a perfect alliteration. The sound P would be repeated, and that is why I think he used poison. Diabolic tail, this is transferred epithet. The adjective diabolic has been transferred from the scorpion to his tail. So the poet says it's a diabolic tail. He risked the rain again. Clearly, the sound of R is repeated, so this is alliteration. Let's move on. The peasants came like swarms of flies and buzzed the name of God 100 times to paralyze the evil one. Peasants, you must have studied in history a lot, poor agricultural laborers. They all meant good, they came in for help, but they don't have the proper education that is required here to solve this issue. And they gathered around like flies. They did not have much education, and thus they immediately sought divine intervention. They thought that that is the only thing that can bring relief to mother. They should have instead done what? They should have rushed to get medical aid, but they did not have the required scientific approach, and so they only relied on chanting the name of God. Let's also note that G of God and the E in evil are in capital because anything that is good and bad is always in capital. Anything referred to God is always capital. So is the case with the evil things. Let's study the figures of speech. Like swarms of flies. Now the word like is very important here, which will tell you that it is simile. The peasants are directly compared with the swarms of flies. Students should understand that whenever you are asked to name and explain the figures of speech, only naming it doesn't give you marks. Name and explain the figures of speech. So you have to write down the explanation why you think it's simile. The evil one. Now this is metaphor because the scorpion has been implicitly, which means indirectly, compared to be an evil creature. Now here is the thing. Some schools, some teachers will give 100 times uttering or chanting the name of God 100 times a hyperbole. But in my opinion, if you have ever noticed this, that in such a situation, chanting the name of God 100 times is absolutely reasonable and plausible. It is not a case of hyperbole, in my opinion. If you have ever used the rosary, also you'll understand chanting the name of God 100 times isn't exactly a hyperbole. And given the fact that that is the only thing the peasants were doing, then it doesn't become a hyperbole. So that's my observation, of course, and I've given you the reason why I believe so. Let's continue with the poem. With candles and with lanterns, throwing giant scorpion shadows on the mud-baked walls, they searched for him. He was not found. They clicked their tongues with every movement that the scorpion made. His poison moved in mother's blood, they said. Now, the images are quite nice. It gives you a picture of how it must have been. Of course, it was rainy season at that time. The peasants believed that the scorpion must be found and killed, as every movement that it made was affecting mother's health adversely, and this shows their lack of understanding because there is no connection between the scorpion making movement and mother being more affected after she has already been stung. So the mud baked walls, is it not? So mud baked is an example of a compound word. Students should note that it is not compound only because there's a hyphen there. There are so many compound words without the hyphen, so it's not to be confused with. Hyphenation is not necessarily an indication of a compound word alone, but mud baked is certainly a good example. Let's study the figures of speech here, guys. With candles and with lanterns, clearly repetition. The word with has been repeated for a better poetic effect. Throwing giant scorpion shadows. Now this is very interesting. This one is spun, and why it is spun is because this can mean two things. Number one, that the huge scorpion shadow was cast on the wall, or it could also mean that the peasants together, remember there were a lot of peasants in the house, so they together must have made a huge shadow as if they were the giant scorpion. And especially true because they were not doing much to improve the situation. All they were doing is chanting the name of God. So this is a very nice example of pun. They clicked their tongues. This is onomatopoeia. Remember the spelling, Onomatopoeia, and it's because the clicking sound has been expressed here. They said. Now there will be occasions where you would have this they said at the end, and every time it would have been correct if they said would have began the line. So here it's inversion clearly, because they said should have introduced the line rather than the line terminating with they said. Let's continue. May he sit still, they said. May the sins of your previous births be burned away tonight, they said. May your suffering decrease the misfortunes of your next birth, they said. May the sum of all evil, balanced in this unreal world against the sum of good, become diminished by your pain. May the poison purify your flesh of desire and your spirit of ambition, they said, and they sat around on the floor with my mother in the center, the peace of understanding on each face. Now here you will notice that many lines begin or are introduced with the word may. Now such a thing in poetic devices is known as um, anaphora. Now we have studied the unit 1.1. In fact, there's a video on our channel to study unit 1.1. If you haven't even yet watched it, you should go after this video, maybe go to that video and learn. So this is anaphora. Whenever the poet uses the same word, expression, phrase to introduce many lines for a bigger impact, it's called anaphora. So there, if you remember, going back to the example of unit 1.1, Rabindranath Tagore introduced many lines with where. So where there is education for all, where there is no fear. So he was describing the ideal situation, each thought, by introducing the line with where. So let's study the figures of speech here. May he sit still. Again, the student should note that the poet is using the pronoun he for scorpion. So may he sit still clearly is the sound S getting repeated, so it's alliteration. Again, they said, as we saw previously, that it's inversion. May the poison purify your flesh. Now this is very important. This is not exactly antithesis. This is oxymoron. Okay. Now, why I think you should study this a little more carefully is because it is a contradictory idea. Whenever you have exactly opposite words in the sentence, you can say it's antithesis. Here, poison and purify are not exactly opposite words, but then the idea is contradictory because you're expecting poison. Rather, the peasants are expecting the poison to purify the flesh, where actually it's going to kill mother if there's no urgent treatment done, if handled carelessly the situation. It's alliteration as well for the sound P, purify and poison. More candles more lanterns, more neighbors, more insects, and the endless rain. My mother twisted through and through, groaning on a mat. Now, this one shows the seriousness of the situation. As the time was passing by, there were more peasants that entered, having no clue about what to do, and it was raining heavily, and the poet's mother was writhing in pain. Now, I want you guys to Google this or study this more. The phrase writhing in pain. It can really serve you well while you attempt your writing skill topics like essays, report writing. Writhing in pain. Okay. Now, insects, the word insects here is very interesting because that, again, I believe strongly is an example of pun. So, what is pun? We've done it previously. Pun is when one line or a word could mean two different things. It's ambiguous. So, here, pun could mean number one, a lot of insects that entered the house because of course it was the rainy season and it's a typical village setup, so in reality there could be a lot of insects that enter, or it could mean the peasants who are said to be the insects, because already earlier in this poem even we've seen that they have been compared with swarms of flies. So insects is a very nice example of pun. More candles, more lanterns, more neighbors, more insects. That's clearly an example of climax because the ideas are arranged in an ascending order. They go upwards. Also, because of the word more getting repeated, it's an example of repetition. Through and through clearly is repetition for the word through. Groaning on a mat. The poet's mother was in anguish and she was groaning. Groaning is a cry of pain. So that shows that it is onomatopoeia, so the groaning sound. The endless rain. Now this, I believe, is hyperbole. Earlier, you remember we discussed about name of God being chanted 100 times. It's not, according to me, a hyperbole. But this one is because it's endless rain. And I can understand heavy shower, a downpour, but it cannot be endless rain. There has to be an end to that. So I believe this is a better example of hyperbole if you're searching for one. Let's continue. My father, skeptic rationalist, trying every curse and blessing, powder, mixture, herb, and hybrid. He even poured a little paraffin upon the bitten toe and put a match to it. Here, before we begin the explanation, I would want the students to study the word skeptic. It's spelled S-C-E-P-T-I-C. That's because of the British English, the UK English, or the Indian English. In American English, it would probably be S-K-E, skeptic. Now let's go ahead and understand what the lines mean. The poet's father was a man who highly doubted the techniques adopted by the peasants to bring relief to mother. So clearly he appears to be the man who understands what to do, and he didn't just rely on divine intervention. He used paraffin and he put a match to it. Paraffin wax is what he used, and it's inflammable. So he put a match to that. Although I must confess that I am not sure of that being a remedy for this. Now, curse and blessing, clearly these are two opposite words, and so this is an example of antithesis. Earlier, if you remember the oxymoron example that we studied, not to be mistaken as antithesis. Now, this one is antithesis because curse and blessing are exactly opposite words. This one is antithesis. Powder, mixture, herb, and hybrid. Now, this will be a climax because of the ascending order. An interesting one, this is alliteration because of the sound H being repeated. Why I said interesting is because again, when it comes to Indian English, H-E-R-B will be pronounced herb, whereas in US it would rather be herb, where the H is not, it does not make the her sound. Okay, so here it is definitely alliteration. Now let's continue with the poem. I watched the flame feeding on my mother. I watched the holy man perform his rites to tame the poison with an incantation. After 20 hours, it lost its sting. So poet watched his mother bear the agony, especially more now after what father did, and he's watching that in horror because he watched his mother really writhing in pain, crying out of pain, groaning in pain. The holy man kept chanting mantras, and eventually, after 20 painful hours, the effect of poison finally began to subside. That means the impact started to reduce. Now, it is debatable whether that happened because of just simply passage of time or whether it was because of what father did. Poet's mother finally began feeling a little better. Now, I watched. A couple of lines begin here with I watched. So, this is repetition. You can say it's an example of anaphora. Anaphora is repetition, but it's the repetition of the expression at the start. So, you call it anaphora. It is basically repetition. The flame feeding on my mother. Now, this one is personification. If I am not wrong, the first in this poem. Personification, because the flame has been given the human quality of feeding. If I may add, the poet has actually used him for scorpion. That could also be a little example of personification. The poet hasn't used the pronoun it, if you remember. Now, of course, this one is alliteration as well because flame and feeding, the F sound, is repeated for a better poetic effect. Now, the climax, something that I simply love this part. This is my favorite part. My mother only said, "Thank God the scorpion picked on me and spared my children." Now, that's mother for you. And such a lovely image I got here. It's lovely. This is mother for you. Of all the pain that she endured, 20 hours, 20 painful hours, the moment she began to feel a little better, instead of cursing the situation and what had happened, the first thing she does is she thanks God that it was me who was stung and the scorpion spared my baby. Okay, so because my children could not have suffered or been able to bear the pain the way I did. I was able to fight with it somehow. So this shows, and this reminds me something that I'm going to share with you. What late APJ Abdul Kalam had said. The great APJ Abdul Kalam, the once president of India, that when it comes to mother, when you're born, that's the only time when you cry and you see your mom smiling. I repeat, the only time when you are born, when you arrive on this planet, that's the only time when your mother smiles while you're crying, because throughout your lifetime that ain't happening again. Never ever will it happen again that you are in pain, you are crying, and your mother is smiling. So that's a very nice observation. Let's go on. As I said, this is an extremely emotional end to the poem. Poet's mother began to feel better, and she was thanking God for it was she who was stung, not her children. Now, this is an important line to remember. This shows the true selfless love of a mother, and it is simply amazing. Figures of speech here. My mother, it's alliteration for the sound M, that is repeated. And this is something interesting. The line, "Thank God the scorpion picked on me." This, according to me, is exclamation. Although the line doesn't have the punctuation mark, exclamation, punctuation mark. In my opinion, it's a very strong emotion of thanking God here. Okay, so this is exclamation because strong emotions are expressed. Alright then, I hope that you found the video very helpful and I was able to add something to your knowledge. Thank you so much for watching it. Thank you for your time. And as I always say, up until next time, keep learning, keep enjoying, keep getting better. And up until next time, bye-bye.